Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to today's session. My name is Mac Alonge. I will be taking you through the course of the next hour or so. We will be discussing building an EDI baseline, so it's essentially effectively using equality, diversity and inclusion data as a means to establish where you're at from an equality, diversity and inclusion perspective. I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of an overview as to who we are as the Equal Group, then going to run through our approach to helping companies on their equality, diversity and inclusion journey. I'm then going to be joined by an individual, Karen Middleton, who is the CEO of the Charted Society of Physiotherapy, just to talk through their experience in working with the Equal Group. Then we're going to open up for questions and answers at the end. If you do have any questions as we go through this conversation, please do put your hand up or put your question in the chat. I'm absolutely not precious about being interrupted at any point during the course of this. And yes, just to kind of set the ground rules for this call, this is a safe space. We will be exploring topics that you may or may not have had personal experience of. Please feel free to participate as much or as little as you feel comfortable. Mindful that this is an afternoon session, so do feel free to eat your lunch or have a drink of tea, coffee, otherwise during the course of this presentation. Take breaks as and when you need, but also please do be mindful of people sharing their views. This is a judgment-free zone. We don't consider there to be any such thing as a silly question. If you do feel that you have a question that you want us to keep confidential, then by all means do engage in chat. You can message me personally, and I will ask the question on your behalf without revealing your identity. This is designed to be an interactive space, so please do feel free to interact during the course of this session. So as I said, my name is Mac Alonge. I'm the CEO of the Equal Group. Our mission is to help organizations to unleash the full potential of their companies by identifying and eliminating bias, typically using data and technology. Our ultimate vision is to enable a business world without bias. Our approach is essentially to unlock or help organizations to unlock as much equality, diversity and inclusion data as possible. Using that data as a starting point, we can then identify operational gaps in the way that organizations work. These gaps are typically around demographic groupings, intersectional identities, but also can be around the fundamentals of the organization. So looking at different levels of seniority across the organization, different functional departments, but also distinguishing differences between kind of external and internal factors. We use those gaps that we've identified to set strategic targets, so really enabling organizations to understand where they're at versus where they want to be, and being really deliberate and intentional about designing and implementing strategic interventions that are targeted specifically at their need. The last two elements are really important in terms of tracking progress over time, and in that approach, refining, replanning and repeating. We don't see equality, diversity and inclusion as a one and done solution. There has to be continual focus, and as with all things, the more you do it over time, the better you will tend to get. I'm really pleased to lead this organization of diverse individuals. We are a team of 16 currently, dedicated to helping organizations on their equality, diversity and inclusion journey. We're really committed to not just preaching equality, diversity and inclusion, but also practicing it. So we look to role model equality, diversity and inclusion to the organizations that we work with. As with all things, we're on a journey. We're absolutely not perfect, but our intention is to really set a tone for what good looks like. These are a number of the clients that we've worked with. I won't dwell too much on this slide. Hopefully there's some names in there that you recognize. So as I said, pleased to be joined by Karen Middleton, the CEO of the Charted Society of Physiotherapy. Prior to inviting her on, I'm just going to go through a couple of slides that essentially break down for you one of the tools that we use to help organizations on their journey, and that is the impact framework. So this is a framework that we've developed during the course of working with a number of organizations and really just giving companies a means to assess where they are and also how they move forward in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion. It's really important that companies have a structured way of progressing with this work. We do understand that there is a lot of nuance and a lot of challenges in organizations making as much progress as possible. So this is kind of 6 key aspects that we have distilled in terms of companies focusing on what's important in getting the most out of equality, diversity and inclusion. So the first step is Imagine. So that's really about ensuring that organizations have a clear view and vision for the future of their organization, really being deliberate and intentional about what it is that they want to achieve. Everything starts with the imagination. If you can't dream it, you can't bring it to reality. But one of the first steps is really being clear in terms of what that starting position is, what's the reason that equality, diversity and inclusion is important to you as an organization. The more you can clarify that for your leadership team and your organization, the more equipped or the better equipped you are to achieve that. Step 2 is really about measurement, and this is kind of a key aspect of the work that we do with organizations. So measuring equality, diversity and inclusion really looks at a number of key aspects of how you run your business. The first level typically is where organizations look at the representation of their employees. So who's in your organization, at what level are they, what protected characteristics or non-protected characteristics do they share. The next is really looking at employee retention. So to what extent are you as an organization able to retain employees, and what differences do you see across different departments or across different intersectional identities? Remuneration really looks at pay and reward, and hopefully you would have all seen in the last couple of years an increasing focus on the gender pay gap, and in recent years a lot of organizations have started to look at ethnicity pay gaps and also disability pay gaps. But really this is about being conscious of the way that you pay your staff. Learning and development really looks at the extent to which you as an organization present learning and development opportunities for individuals across your organization. So how is that done? What learning and development opportunities are available for people to leverage? And really being intentional about who gets those opportunities to progress across your organization. Inclusion generally really looks at the way that people feel when they interact with your organization, and then candidate attraction looks at the external environment as and when you are looking to bring people on board to grow essentially. In terms of what can specifically be measured, we often look at this in 3 aspects. So the personal relates to the protected characteristics. Protected characteristics are the characteristics that are protected by law. So legislation is the Equality Act 2010. Within that legislation, it makes it clear that there are 9 characteristics where discrimination can occur, and the legislation is designed to protect those individuals based on their characteristic backgrounds. Experiential is looking at the way in which people feel supported within an organization. Often there are kind of words that you use around inclusion, belonging, authenticity, but it's really looking at what that lens looks like from a qualitative aspect. And then organizational, looking at the aspects of an organization that individuals take on. So how long they've been in the organization, their grade, seniority, the department that they're in, but also some of the educational background. So if you look at the training courses that individuals have undertaken, that can give you more of a sense for who those individuals are and how they may experience the workplace generally. So one aspect of measurement really looks at the visibility of data. So we like to use this diagram to really represent kind of the importance of looking at the aspects of people's backgrounds that aren't necessarily visible. And it's those issues generally that are kind of more important when you look at the tendency for people to experience inclusion and belonging within organizations. The ability of you as an organization to assess this on a frequent basis will really set you in good stead for moving forward and making the most of equality, diversity and inclusion. We find that the issues that are kind of below the surface are often ones that people are most sensitive about. The issues that people don't disclose are the areas where you tend to have most of the issues. That's not to say that the characteristics that you can see are not important, but just to show that there's a depth of understanding that is needed that you can't necessarily see at face value. One of the questions that comes up really frequently is how can organizations increase their disclosure rates? Typically we find that organizations struggle with disclosure rates where people aren't necessarily indicating what their views are, but B, what their demographic characteristics are. So there's a number of factors that are important. The first of those factors is trust, so ensuring that you've got an environment where people can be completely anonymous in disclosing who they are and also how they feel. It's important to have the right level of expertise, so engaging with equality, diversity, inclusion data experts can really help to assure your employees that you are moving in the right direction and that you have considered this in a well-meaning way. And then time is also something that we often hear organizations struggle with. So when we work with organizations, we typically help them to deliver results within 1 to 2 months. In terms of visibility, we often achieve disclosure rates of 80% plus, and that is across all demographic characteristics. So taking a holistic view to match demographic characteristics with also inclusion data to provide an informed and intersectional view of what your potential issues are or opportunities to improve the way that you do equality, diversity and inclusion generally. So step 3 in our impact framework is preparation. One of the questions that often comes up is looking at the business case for equality, diversity, and inclusion. It's less so an issue now, but it does come up from time to time. And it's really about understanding the business drivers for you as an organization as to the benefits of really engaging with effective equality, diversity, and inclusion. So we've noted down a couple of things here that are probably the most universally applicable, but it's important for you to understand your organization, understand your drivers for equality, diversity, and inclusion. But these drivers can include things like innovation and productivity, so ensuring that you have different voices represented around the table to really improve the way that you innovate, product development, service development, ensuring that you're able to meet the needs of the community that you serve, whether that's in a B2B or B2C context. Reputational growth and also reputational damage. So what is the opportunity for you to improve your reputation across the industry that you work in, but also what are the risks associated with that? I think in recent years we've seen a lot of companies perhaps take unnecessary missteps in terms of their ability to provide for different communities in a more holistic way. Staff morale and retention, so the extent to which you can improve the working environment for your employees and also retain great talent. The recruitment process is one that comes up time and time again. If you're only looking at a siloed community, that doesn't necessarily give you the best starting point for improving who you're bringing into the organization, but also once they're in the organization, ensuring that they've got the environment needed to really progress and to do great work. And then legal costs, I think, is one that comes up time and time again in relation to the costs of defending employment tribunals. So it's really important that you get ahead of that to understand the difference that equality, diversity, and inclusion can make to your organisation. In terms of preparation, people often ask what is an appropriate equality, diversity, inclusion budget. That will depend on 3 main factors. So what are you trying to achieve? How well do you articulate the business case in terms of the opportunity cost and the cost benefits? And then thirdly, what is your starting point? So really being specific as to what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and making sure that you have a clear indication of what success looks like to you. The next point on the impact framework is action. So really being specific about the action that you're going to take. Within that context, you need to look at the objectives. So what is it that you're specifically trying to achieve? Break that down into tasks. So being really crystal clear about the actions that you're going to take. The team, so really assigning responsibilities to ensure that you have clarity around who's going to do what are the dependencies also tied up in that. Scheduling, so looking at the deadlines and milestones, and then finally kind of planning out exactly how that's going to work from a resource allocation perspective. And in brackets there we've put replanning, so often you will have an idea of what you want to do. That isn't always a straightforward process. Plans change and you need to be flexible enough to adapt as and when kind of resources move in and out of your organization or your circumstances change. And then finally executing on that plan. So ensuring that you have the ability to evaluate and monitor what's happening, when are things being delayed, ensuring you've got the ability to course correct as and when needed. The 5th step on the impact framework is communication. So really being intentional about who you communicate with, both internally and externally. What are the messages that you're delivering? So looking at progress that's being made, also where things have changed, as I mentioned in the last slide. If things are changing, how do you keep people aware of that, and also to keep them on side and engaged? Delivery, what are the appropriate comms channels for you to use? Internally, we're typically looking at things like newsletters or intranet systems, as well as all staff communications. I know we'll hear from Karen a little bit later that they've got various channels that they use to communicate with employees. Scheduling, so how frequently should you be delivering messages, both internally and externally, and who there's a source and who needs to be the source of that messaging. So who is the best placed person to provide that message. Those are kind of 5 factors that you should be considering as and when you communicate your progress in relation to equality, diversity, inclusion, and hopefully that will stand you in good stead going forward. And then the last aspect of kind of the impact framework is to track. So really looking at how you track progress from both a qualitative and quantitative perspective. A lot of organizations use kind of real-time monitoring tools such as pulse surveys or quarterly reviews. These are really important, but it's also important to look at both the quantitative and qualitative. So from qualitative perspective, looking at the use of focus groups, driving out case studies as to when certain interventions have been successful or not, and also employee resource group insights can also be beneficial to providing a wider context as to how certain initiatives are being received by specific groups across your organization. Staff surveys are a good mix, or should be a good mix of both quantitative and qualitative. Exit interviews are also a really good source of information, and then equality, diversity, and inclusion data audits, combining both the qualitative and quantitative. From a purely quantitative perspective, looking at HR data can give you an insight into what's happening. Recruitment statistics as well. A lot of organizations use applicant tracking systems to really capture who's applying for certain positions and also what the success rate is across demographic groupings. And then finally, industry comparisons. So we've been involved in a lot of cross-industry work to measure the impact of equality, diversity, inclusion from a cross-sector perspective. So that's the impact framework in summary. We advise that companies at least look to refresh their equality, diversity, and inclusion strategy on an annual basis, make improvements where needed, and if possible, do engage with external partners to validate your outputs. External partners can help you to really frame and reframe what you're doing, how you're doing it, how you're communicating, and also just give you a spare set of eyes in terms of what's working well and what isn't. So just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to Karen about the work that we have been assisting the CSP with, and just to kind of give a little bit of context to the work. We first started talking in 2020, and there was I guess a need across the CSP to get a sense for where they were as at that time. And we broke down the work that we did with them into a number of stages. So firstly, helping with a little bit of a communications plan to engage with staff, to ensure that staff knew what was going on, what the reason for the work was, and also that they had a sense of how they could engage with that process going forward. We also looked at their policies and procedures, so giving them a little bit of an understanding as to where improvements could be made across their documentation. We looked to deliver both quantitative and qualitative insights through staff surveys, interviews and focus groups, and then produced a recommendations report with relevant practical and evidence-based suggestions. So that was delivered early in 2021, and since then the CSP have been working both internally and externally to improve their equality, diversity, and inclusion outputs. One of the key recommendations was to look at the leadership aspect of the CSP and really create a means for leaders to truly understand, truly champion EDI, and also to disseminate that learning across the organisation. Just to say, we've also just completed our second audit with the CSP, and we will be sharing results in the next couple of weeks or months even. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Karen to join me on screen, and I guess we'll hopefully share a little bit of an insight into your experience working with us. So let me just see if I can make this work. I will give you a spotlight, and yeah, I think firstly, Karen, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, so I'm Karen Middleton. I'm the Chief Executive at the Charted Institute of Physiotherapy. I've been here since 2014. I am a registered physiotherapist, although probably anything clinical I'm likely to do would be either lacking in evidence or illegal now. So my sort of scope of practice is around leadership and management, and I have a particular interest in organisational development, which my master's was in. And the CSP is the professional body and trade union for physiotherapists, support workers and students working right across the UK. So we're a UK-wide body. We have 63,000 members across the UK, and at the moment we have 162 staff, again working across the UK, either office-based or home workers, but a very flexible arrangement so that staff can work where they need to work, when they need to work, and how they need to work. So that's sort of an overview of the organisation and myself.
Fantastic. And I know we first started talking in kind of late 2020. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of the drivers for you conducting the audit? What was your sense, I guess, as CEO, as to the need to undertake an EDI audit?
Yes, so back in 2020, we were sort of deep in dealing with the pandemic and supporting our members in the pandemic. And then there was the murder of George Floyd in the States, and the Black Lives Matter sort of movement accelerated in this country, and the profile of the need to focus on equity, diversity and inclusion significantly increased. I would say that it wasn't that we weren't doing any work in this area, but I'd be wrong to say that this was a priority or that it pervaded all our work, because it didn't. To my shame, I felt very ignorant about what needed to be done, and a bit panicky, if I'm absolutely honest. A lot of fellow chief executives were issuing statements, public declarations, etc., etc. And I had this sort of instinct that to do something like that without anything underpinning it felt potentially tokenistic. I'm not saying that the others that did do that, it was tokenistic, but I felt that we could end up feeling great about publishing a statement. So in fact, I issued 2 apologies, one to my staff and one externally, with a commitment that we were going to start doing some work that would be transformative rather than transactional, and that I wouldn't be sending everyone on an unconscious bias course and ticking my sort of performance indicator to say, right, we've done EDI, off we go. So I started doing a whole load of listening with staff and with members, and with all the best intentions, you know, inviting everyone to be as candid as they could be. You can tell me anything you want, it won't go any further, etc., etc. I mean, how naive was I? And it started becoming clear, particularly with staff, that you know, telling the CEO all did not feel a safe space. And actually, as the CEO, I found that really hard to accept in itself. There was also a degree of skepticism, because prior to me joining the CSP, apparently there had been some work done before or started. Nothing had sort of apparently come about as a result of the work. So those who had seen it all before were very skeptical about, well, what's different this time? It was also very difficult for people with lived experience of discrimination and oppression, and what became very clear was there was a lack of trust, frankly, and a lot of questions about how do we know what we think we know? So assumptions being made, people talking about their instinct, generalizations being made, etc. So it became very clear that we needed to start from a position of being informed by data. And the staff were very clear that what they wanted to see was a forum to speak openly and anonymously with an external partner. And so the combination of the need to start with data somehow and the need for that external partner led us to the Equal Group. And in fact, I was not involved in any of the recruitment. We invited staff who were interested and actively involved to get involved in the tender process, writing the tender that they wanted to see, and then recruiting the Equal Group. So that's how it all started, really. It was the need to do some work that was going to be transformative and anchored in data, really.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess you mentioned a couple of things there about the discomfort for you as a leader and kind of, I guess, that whole dynamic around wanting to do something but having to actually slow down a little bit and potentially remove yourself from that situation. How was it for you? And I'm guessing you don't take that approach with all of your tenders to let kind of staff lead on that. I guess what kind of feelings, thoughts, fears, anxieties did you have around that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole, as you know, Mac, I mean, this whole experience for the last 2 years has probably been the most significant piece of work that I have ever done in my career, in my professional career. It has touched me personally, professionally. It's caused me to feel shame. It's caused me to learn, and primarily it's caused me to really understand my privilege and the power of my privilege. So to hand over power in a really small way, I'm not in any way suggesting, you know, I've stepped away from being a chief exec or anything like that, but even doing it in that very small way was instructive on what it feels like to hand over power. And, you know, I was interested as you were going through your slides, and it all sounds very linear, and it may sound very linear to the audience listening, but I was sort of thinking to myself, yeah, but there's lots of backward steps around that circle, and then you go forward again, and then you might go back 2 steps and then forward again. And it's not easy work, and but you have to hold on to what you're aiming for and your vision around it. And one of the things that caused me to take several backward steps was because I had this overwhelming urgency to make everything right. And I've read a lot about this white savior complex, and I think I had some of that, frankly. Also, as physiotherapists, if any of you have ever lived or worked with physiotherapists, we have a need to solve and sort, and this for me was just one more thing that I needed to solve and sort. And not only when it came to the audit that we did with the equal group, but the wider EDI, or as we call it, EDB. So our strategy is called Equity, Diversity and Belonging, which is member facing and staff facing. We had to slow down so many times because we were doing it in a way that we've done all other work. You know, you set a plan and off you go. But in order to really do it in co-production, in partnership, it takes longer. And particularly when you're dealing with people expressing their lived experience, acknowledging the emotion and the hard work that has to go on there, we had to slow down several times. So it felt very different from leading or managing anything else I've done. And yes, I did have to sort of deal with my own need to sort of control it, run it, sort it and finish it as quickly as possible. You know, and those were all good intentions, but actually this work takes longer, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we often encourage leaders that we work with on, that this work will never finish. There's no, you know, there's no end point. You have to continue to challenge yourself. You have to continue to, as uncomfortable as it may sound, put yourself into a position of discomfort. And you know, I think we as individuals and as organizations tend to operate best outside of our comfort zones. But taking it back a little bit, could you talk to us about kind of your experience of working with the Equal Group and how the actual audit went?
Yes, so the communication up front and planning that communication was absolutely critical, with advice from yourselves, and sort of laying that out was important. But as soon as we started, or you started the work, you know, we ran into difficulties, and you sort of come up against the very culture that you're trying to address and solve. So, you know, it's all very well saying, I mean, I think, Matt, your organisation issued all sorts of explanations about it was all anonymous, we wouldn't see any, nothing would be attributed. I mean, honestly, it was incessant, the sort of reassurance that was provided, and yet staff didn't believe it. And, you know, I mean, it just illustrated how far we had to go, really. And so that was really hard. So the work started with a combination of a survey that went out to all staff, and that was where we had to deal with all this the anonymity issue. Then there was all the work to look at our data. And of course, that was incredibly uncomfortable because, you know, you were asking for data that we didn't have. So it's very exposing, and you sort of have to get over yourself, really. I mean, a bit like I talk about feeling uncomfortable throughout of this, you know, if me feeling uncomfortable is what it takes, well, that's a small price to pay against the lived experience of some of my staff, and certainly our members. So going through our data felt exposing. And then there was the focus groups that you had, and obviously I only know about any focus groups that I was involved in, sort of like the leadership team, etc. But it was very comprehensive. It was very rounded. What I would say is that it was a lot more work for us than we anticipated. So I think, you know, one thing I would say to anybody who's listening is that you bring in a partner, you know, certainly working with the equal group, it isn't about saying, right, here you go, equal group, now tell us at the end of it. We had to engage with it, even if it was simply providing all the information that was asked for. So, you know, you can't go into it thinking you can sort of do this as well as. Something has to go. And the only thing that I would say in excuse in our defense was that we were in the middle of the pandemic. And so it was just, you know, a nightmare. Well, in fact, I've always said, I had to do a sort of similar podcast about my lessons during the pandemic. And I would say the pandemic paled into insignificance when it came to this work. This was the work that was my priority for the organisation. I also found conversations with you, Matt, really helpful. I felt immediately able, I mean, it's a very lonely place as a chief executive, white, cisgender, heterosexual, you know, uncertain of the language, anxious to do the right thing, but almost that anxiety sort of led me down wrong routes at times. So having you there, and I think, you know, I mean, you were always very kind in pointing out if I was saying or doing something wrong, but so you need the challenge, but you do need the critical friend, because you need somebody who has seen it before in other organizations, so that you know, you're not feeling like you're the only person that's going through this. The other thing was, of course, for me as a leader of the organization, was dealing with or supporting a lot of my my directors, my assistant directors, who were feeling particularly vulnerable, and partly because of the minimal diversity in that group. So you know, you're going through a process where you're coping with your own feelings, you're leading the organization through this transformation, you're being exposed by working with an organization that's coming in and asking you for things, and you're trying to support your staff. So having you there was critical to me, actually. I don't think we actually sort of spoke that often, but when we did, you were very available and supportive. And then when it came to the final report, your advice around how to share it with staff, what then to do, and you know, anybody who's considering this work, you need to be planning for what you're going to do when you get the report way ahead of when you get to receive it. And second time around, you know, as Matt said, we're just coming out of the audit and expecting the report in a few weeks. We've got all that planned out. So yeah, so that was what it was like. It was uncomfortable, it was great, and everything in between, I think.
Great, fantastic. And we're going to be kind of opening up for questions and answers shortly. So if you do have any questions, do feel free to drop them in the chat, or get ready to kind of jump on camera and share. I guess final question for you. You mentioned towards the end there the impact on your leadership team, directors and associate directors. I guess what has the impact been, and I guess how have you changed your approach to leading the organisation as a result of the audit?
Making less assumptions, making sure that we're asking the right questions. We produced our EDB strategy last October, which was for members as well as for staff. We have taken the decision, well, we haven't, the members, because we're a member-led organisation, our council has taken the decision to combine the two strategies in our corporate, so to combine the EDB strategy with our corporate strategy so that it runs through every single work stream that we're doing. However, we can still pull out the EDB elements for reporting, for monitoring, and all of the things that you mentioned. It's made us, we've all got a heightened sense of awareness around equity, diversity and inclusion. Who's in the room, who's at a meeting, who's on an interview panel, how we're making presentations accessible, for example. I mean, you know, I could go on and on how it's impacted on all of us. We are all undergoing, you know, training in this area. We are all, which is now expected for all staff to attend, like you would on GDPR or any other sort of mandatory training. And we are doing lots of facilitated discussions in teams and in directorates about how people are. We have had an interesting sort of negative reaction from some feeling that they're EDB exhausted. And this is an interesting one in terms of who's feeding that in. And I suspect, and it may come out in our audit, I don't know, but I suspect it's people like me who are feeling like, you know, will I ever understand this? Who are feeling challenged, who are feeling uncomfortable, feeling vulnerable, actually, potentially making mistakes, and because it's hard work. And I think that that's where potentially the exhaustion is coming in, but we'll see if that comes through the audit at all. We've also been much more confident about speaking as an organisation externally about these issues. We have put additional resource into supporting our 3 diversity networks, which are member-led. We have set up, or we haven't, but a group of staff have established themselves as an equity, diversity and belonging group, providing peer support to each other. And so it's sort of, rather than being a thing in itself, it's everywhere. And you know, and don't get me wrong, we have a long way to go. And you know, my fear about the audit, it's just going to illustrate how far we still have got to go. But I do think that where it was nowhere, it's somewhere. And all of us are very mindful of it now. So it's had a massive effect on this organisation, massive effect. But the areas where we were prioritising, for example, like culture, you know, you don't change culture overnight. So yeah, there's a lot of work still to do. And as you say, I don't think we'll ever get there, to be honest.
Yeah, I think the intention is to make improvements rather than feeling that you can fix it within the space of a year or two. So thank you so much for joining me, Karen. It's always great to hear you talk and reflect on the journey that you've been through personally and as an organisation. So we've got some questions here. Got some long questions here. I'm going to try my best to read through them. So the first question is from Mike. It says, hi all, in the comms team of a national charity, working on improving representation of stories, voices and images in our comms and marketing to help influence actual representation through recruitment and retention. My question is, how can we best measure improvement in representation, specifically the balance between quantitative, i.e. based on demographic population data, are percentage targets helpful or harmful, and qualitative in terms of how much people internally and externally feel seen, heard, included and represented. That was an extremely long question.
Yes.
But so I think that the crux of the question is, how can we balance quantitative and qualitative and also measure that improvement over time? Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is both. And I mean, we do have percentages, but actually we do quite well in some of the protected characteristics, not so well in others. But what was more interesting that came out of the audit was, and this is why we called it belonging, not inclusion. So we could look really like a really inclusive organisation, but if people don't feel like they belong, it's sort of irrelevant. And I was really struck, for example, in our audit, bearing in mind, although we're not an organisation full of physiotherapists, we are an organisation about physiotherapy. And I was really struck in the audit how our disabled staff feel about being able to speak out. And the number of staff that had mental health issues that had been unable to speak out. So I think you have to do both. Otherwise, you're in danger of missing something absolutely critical. The other thing that I would say, just out of interest, was how much the work that we've done internally around our data mirrors what's happening more widely in the profession. And, you know, from a systemic point of view, I completely get that is likely to be the case. So we've also found, for example, that our disabled members, so physiotherapists who have a disability, are also feeling that lack of sense of belonging. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's really about doing both. And I think the percentage targets are helpful, but not on their own, is all I would say.
Absolutely. And I think just to add to that, you know, you have to take an intersectional approach. So sometimes we get wrapped up in kind of specific demographics and specific populations without understanding that oftentimes those kind of, you know, it's a little bit of a Venn diagram in terms of the way that we look at demographic groups. And then also matching that with the qualitative. So representation is one thing, but as Karen said, you know, do people feel like they belong in the organization? Do they feel like they are part and parcel of what you're trying to achieve? And I think the other thing that I'd add to that is to try as much as possible to ensure that comms is two-way. So it's not just about preaching a message, but, you know, as Karen reflected on, taking a step back and offering people that opportunity to really critique you and to guide you in terms of the improvements that you can make to how you're approaching things. Great, hopefully that answers that question. Next question is from Andrew Hastings. How can organizations help to break through the D&I exhaustion, which some colleagues feel with so many conflicting priorities, pandemic, return to work, and then within DEI itself, covering so many demographic characteristics? How is the focus kept without burnout? Karen, I know that you
yeah, I mean, I can only talk about my experience, and, you know, just because I'm here, I'm not an expert, and you know, I would not want anyone to think either I am or that the organization has got this all right. I think what I've learned is that you have to make some really honest decisions to start with about what you are and what you are not going to do, and to commit to everything that needs to be done and then not be able to deliver it just builds mistrust and skepticism, and it all goes, any mileage that you've achieved, you know, will just be lost. So we had to be really clear about what we are going to focus on and where the biggest bang for your buck is going to be, frankly, in terms of what's going to have the biggest impact in this situation in terms of staff, because people can't do everything. We also have we made a strategic decision that this work is a priority. So other work had to stop. And you know, because we're member led, those were conversations that had to happen with our council. You know, I was in a number of meetings where I said we could either do that or this, you know, you have a choice, but we cannot do both. So I think it is the responsibility of leaders and managers to prioritize, to be frank and honest about what will be done. There's also something about phasing. So, you know, not all the work has to be done or started immediately. But the other thing is that, you know, we did have to invest more resource in this area and more staffing capacity, because otherwise we simply wouldn't have got through the work. So yeah, I mean, but I also do think there is also another element to this exhaustion, which is, as I explained earlier, the exhaustion that comes with learning, trying to get it right, not making mistakes, and being vulnerable. I think that some of the exhaustion is about that too. So safe spaces for people to talk about that and how they're feeling is really critical, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I think the resourcing point is a key one. I think you need to create time and capacity for people to do this work and to do it well. Whether that's time to engage in a survey, time to review outputs, you know, that providing that time is crucial so that people don't think that they're being overburdened or over capacity with this work. And the final point that I'd add to what Karen said is about progress. So one of the reasons that we focus on comms so heavily is that some of that exhaustion comes from feeling like you're doing a lot but not getting much for it. So you have to be open, honest and transparent about the progress that you're making. You know, it's like with kind of an exercise regime, you know, the moment you start seeing progress, you start feeling encouraged by the work. So it's really important to view that and to allow people to buy into the incremental steps that you're making towards your desired outcome. Got a couple more questions here. So Mark Bellinger says, what do you think are the appropriate limits or best methods for trying to collect EDI data beyond the staff group? Example, people speaking at events we run or attending those sessions, events. I think I'll take this on just quickly. We often advocate measuring as much as possible. So if you have the means to measure the people speaking at your events or attending those events, by all means do. The more data you can get, the better. But I think, as Karen alluded to, in terms of the way that they've changed their approach, it's really just awareness. So becoming more aware and intentional about who's represented around the table, who's speaking on your panels, who you're inviting. A lot of what you'll realize is that your default position in terms of who to go to is quite limiting in itself. So the moment you start to challenge that, the more you can challenge your outputs in terms of those events. A question from Rico. My team are looking at an external anonymous reporting tool to help us collect data from reports and grievances from our staff with the view of using this information to allow us to have oversight as to what goes in our workforce. Would you advise this practice, as I fear this might open a can of worms amongst our staff for our HR team? Really good question.
I would say do it. The can of worms will be opened at some point, is my experience, and best best you're in control of the opening. I know that sounds like I'm sort of taking back control, but I would rather, as a leader of an organisation, open the can of worms in a managed way to be able to deal with whatever comes out and the horrors of that you might find, rather than, first of all, knowing that staff somewhere are suffering in silence, and then when it does all blow up, it's you know, uncontrollable, it's difficult to manage, it's difficult to deal with, and you know, I think this isn't the right reason for doing it, but I have learned that you do gain respect if you do go down that path of doing something that's difficult. And you know, if you're worried that there's a can of worms, there probably is. So I would open it up personally.
Absolutely. So last minute now, I just wanted to extend my sincere thanks to Karen and also the rest of the CSP team. And with any questions that we've not managed to get around to, we will be responding to you via email to answer those questions more fully. Please do engage with us on social media, keep the conversation going. We are at the Equal Group on most channels, not all, but you will find us if you Google us. Please feel free to recommend us. We do run these webinars on a regular basis. So the best way to get information about those is to sign up for our newsletter, and we'll be able to share that information with you as and when. Do please give us your feedback on this session. And yeah, just wanted to say thank you all for your time and attention, and look forward to engaging with you all soon.